on here. There we go. Good morning. It's good to have you here this morning. It is 20 after 10. That's early. There's people still walking into church this morning. And so good for you on being on time. I want to start with a question for you. When was the last time that you prayed about something, and because you prayed about it, it made you very uncomfortable? Just sit with that question. And let's move on. So, truck commercials. They're weird. I don't know the last time we've seen a truck commercial. Usually, like a Rock or there's, GMC, Ford, whatever. Usually there's some sort of very masculine person driving this truck, wearing flannel, big beard, and, I don't fit any of those. They're driving, through a mountain into space, camping, and just... none of that really fits. I don't really fit that stereotype. In fact, if I grow my hair on my face any longer than this, Catherine will not even kiss me. So I don't fit that narrative, but I do actually have a truck. We have a truck. We pull a little trailer behind it. There's a long story. Catherine would love to tell you about it, and I mean it. She'd love to tell you how she ended up getting us a truck and a camper trailer, because I never wanted, but we have this little trailer, and we pull it behind our truck 2 or 3 times a year. None times this year, by the way, so far. So this truck is fairly overkill for my lifestyle. I have all this power and all this capability, and we haul a trailer, 2-3 times a year, but mostly it's hauling a huge load of Costco returns. That's basically what I use my truck for the most. I might as well, to be honest, have a horse, because it's probably going to accomplish the same thing. My lifestyle doesn't scream that I need a truck, and I feel like an imposter, so now and then, I throw mud on it, I drive over a couple curbs, and I'm like, okay, I've justified it for this year. All that power available to me, but I don't have a lifestyle that demands its potential. So let me ask you another question. Do you, like me, sometimes feel like much of our Christianity can feel the same, though? You read Acts, and you read these stories of the faith that these people had as they started this persecuted church as it was expanding, or you read the book of Hebrews, which is also the New Testament, and it speaks of the faith acts of so many biblical characters who had such faith and wonder and see God come through to do these incredible things. Or you read Old Testament stories, and we've been going through some of them over the summer, and you think, man, to see God move and work in some of those ways, to have God come through, can there be more for me? Should I be doing more? Can I do more? You have this spiritual horsepower residing in you. There's this song that we sometimes sing on Sunday mornings that say, you have this lion inside of your lungs, and sometimes I feel like, well, what if it's just like a house cat? And it has a hard time even wanting to come out. You feel like should there be more? We read our Bible, and that's a good thing. We pray, we go to church. Some of us, we listen to podcasts, and we engage other church services from around the world with some of these incredible speakers and worship moments. And these are all, like I said, very good, worthwhile things for our faith as we continue to strive to thrive in our spiritual life. But then I don't know if you've ever left with this feeling of, but could there be more, though? Not more inputs, but more outputs. I kind of notice that all this input never actually, I shouldn't say never, but doesn't always translate into feeling like I'm living in a way that we see and experiencing God in these incredible ways. To see Him move, to live a life that really requires God to come through, because if He doesn't, we don't know where we're going to end up, because we know that we live, for example, in a world that has a huge amount of need. Let's just narrow the focus even just to Edmonton. There's a little over 1 million people in Edmonton. And they say over 250,000 of those Edmontonians are non-religious, don't know Jesus, don't subscribe to any religious stance. And the majority of those who say that they're what are called spiritual nuns are mostly teenagers and young adults. There's about another 200,000 Edmontonians listed as non-believers, and I think Jesus' words that he spoke 2,000 years ago still ring true today. The harvest is plentiful. But let's narrow it down a little bit more. Think about your own life. Think about the people you know, the people you go to school with, people you go to work with. Think about the people that maybe you even live with and the amount of need that's happening in their life. Shouldn't someone do something? You know, a few years ago, I was troubled by this personally. I started asking questions like, God, has my need for you kind of disappeared in my life? Or have I failed to notice where you want to work, what you want to do? Like, I went about my life not really needing him or asking him to do anything too large. There was this Christian pastor in the States named Craig Rochelle, and he wrote this book and he coined this term, Christian atheist. And he says, you believe in God, but live like he doesn't exist. And I'm sure that's not where I was. I'm not sure that's not where a lot of us are. But there's still this sense of going, you know, we sing about the grandness and greatness of God, but it's like, when was the last time I felt like he needed to come through and break through? And I felt like maybe that's why sometimes my devotion life felt a little bit stagnant at that point. Yes, like, you know, praying for my kids, there's definitely some hardships and working through those things, but a breakthrough in my life, like the life of my neighbor, or this breakthrough in someone who is, you know, to see God do something miraculous, to step out courageously in faith in the gap for someone. When's the last time I felt like God really had to come through in that space? Like a powerful truck that I mostly take to and from work, you know, here I was reading about praying, preaching, and remaining devoted to a power that my lifestyle didn't actually really need. And there's a couple questions that helped me kind of dig down into that. And they're kind of questions that still I ask myself, and maybe they're good questions for you to ask. And I'll have them here on screen. But they're this: whose life could possibly be changed by my prayers? The second question is, would my life become uncomfortable if God actually answered them? Two haunting but good questions. It was then that I realized that God was inviting me to start living a Christianity that others needed. Like, I knew I needed God, but what would it look like to live a Christianity where other people needed it as well? What difference would that make? Well, we've been in this, like I said, a summer series, going through these different stories of God doing great things in people's lives. And this morning, we're going to look at this gentleman, this guy named Samson. This superhuman who had this strength because of his hair. The Lord gave him this calling. And his story actually spans 3 chapters of the Old Testament book Judges, chapters 13 to 16. You get his birth story, you get ideas of his marriages, you get, when he was captured, you get this idea of getting vengeance, you get a story of him killing people with a donkey jawbone and tying tails of foxes and lighting them on fire. Like, it's just a wild story, the story of Samson. But Samson is clearly a story of what not to do. It always amazed me, how many times, in kids' church, we hear about Samson, this hero of faith, and I was like, you don't want your kid making friends with a Samson. Like, parents, you don't want your daughters bringing home from college Samson. Samson is not a guy that you really want to model your life after. He's the last of the major judges who led the Israelites, but he's, like I said, hardly an ideal role model. He functions more as a vigilante than he does a leader. He breaks the rules of the vow that God had given to him and that set him apart for a specific task. He marries into enemy tribes despite many warnings and despite laws. He murders and commits other atrocities. He trades his God-given supernatural strength along with his calling for personal vendettas and for women. This is not the guy that you want to model your Christianity after. But what's interesting about this Samson narrative, and might I say even somewhat inspiring about it, is this. Despite his obvious weakness, despite his sin, despite his intermarrying, despite his thirst for power and vengeance, Samson was used mightily by God. It's a strange story when you read it. You feel like this guy should be disqualified, but God continues to use Samson mightily throughout his narrative. Why is that the case? Why does he do that? I think one of the main reasons why we see Samson still being used by God in powerful ways is this. He knew his role that we read in verses 13:5, and despite his colorful lifestyle, he still lived like he knew that he stood in the gap between death and the Israelites. He understood he had that call. And let me give you a bit of context at this point. So the Philistines, at this point, have terrified and desecrated the people of Israel. And on Israel's account, they had no more faith really in their own faith. Desirous of peace of any price, it's kind of surrendered its own sentiments, its own beliefs. They no longer look like God's people. They kind of look like the surrounding cultures now. They've given up their identity. They've grown comfortable with no longer standing out. They had no one. They had no courage. They had no strength. They had no unction. They were kind of dead in the water. And Samson was called to deliver these people. And you read where Israelite was at, and sometimes it does feel like Canadian culture now. Here's why I think this story is so important to us. Because I think all of us know that we're called to make a difference. I think all of us know that we're called to do something and to be something different in a culture, especially like this. But how many of us can think of 1,000 reasons why God should not ask you to do anything? Like, how many times have I sat down and like almost created a list of 1,000 other people that God would be better choosing than me? Or how often have you just lost a sense of this incredible call that God has on our everyday lives just because we don't see it happening in us, we don't see it happening through us, or we have a hard time believing that God can do something with you with the little you feel like you have? Or maybe it just feels like, Thomas, there's just so much going on. I feel like I don't have time or margin to give God a little bit more. The Samson story, though, reminds us that God understands exactly who he's working with. He's not surprised by Samson. He's not taken back going, oh my goodness, I didn't see that happening, He doesn't look at you and are surprised by you and the things that you feel like, I just don't know. He's not surprised by any of that. In fact, the story reminds us that he actually cares less about how you feel you fall short and more about this. Despite all of that, will you choose to live a life that allows God to be fully God? In your life and through your life. Just despite where you're at, will you just choose to allow God to be fully God? And it's true, and there's a caveat here. It's true that Samson's moral failure led to ultimate judgment. I mean, he died a terrible death because that's what sin does. Samson continued to live adjacent to God's calling and God's desire and God's goodness, and he paid a hefty penalty for that. Like, could you imagine what Samson maybe could have done if he kind of let God be God in every area of his life? But that's not the Samson story. What we see is this, though, that despite those weaknesses, despite all those things, it actually only highlighted God's power in and through Samson's life. That it had to be God. Take, for example, this really, really interesting story found in Samson's narrative in chapter 14. It reads this. Samson went down to Timnah together with his father and his mother. As they approached the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion came roaring towards him. The Spirit of the Lord, I think if you had a truck, you wouldn't be scared of the lion. But here we are. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as he might have torn a young goat. But he told neither his father nor his mother what he had done. Now, the way that the writer is writing this is they want you to understand that word lion is actually meant to portray an enemy. So an enemy came towards him. And it says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. What's weird is that it wasn't actually Samson's hair that set him apart. It wasn't his terrible sense of judgment that defined this moment. What defined this moment was that Samson put himself between death and his people. And it was at that point where God had to come through, and it says that the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. Samson put himself in a situation where God had to be God. And I asked myself, when was the last time I have done that? But let me give you a quick lesson here. there's a few names that are given to God. And one of them show up in this situation with Samson. And I'll say it this way. So my name's Tomas, T-O-M-A-S, no H. And just so you know, when you email me, if you say T-H-O-M-A-S, I may not get it, but Thomas, T-O-M-A-S. But it's interesting. If someone calls me Tom, immediately I'm thinking, oh, they probably know me before I moved to Alberta. Because everyone that I grew up with, all my friends, they know me as Tom. They call me Tom. My brothers call me Tom. My mom sometimes calls me Tom. Like, they just call me Tom. But when I moved to Alberta, I was Thomas all the time. And my wife, rather's Thomas. People call me Thomas here all the time. If people call me pastor, then I know they probably know me in a certain situation. Or if they say Thomas Regal Belchior, I know that's Catherine yelling at me because I did something wrong. There's all these names, different contexts, right? And that's what we get with God here. And you read through Scripture, and sometimes the name of the Lord or God, it means creator, it means sustainer, it means provider, it means deliverer. And here, when the word Lord shows up, it actually means the spirit of heroic strength. Samson put himself in a position where the spirit of heroic strength had to come through and take over. And it says that it came on him so powerfully that he tore a lion apart like a young goat. Now, I don't know if it's easy or difficult to rip apart a goat. Modern context, thinking maybe Chihuahua, right? Maybe, maybe it's as easy as ripping a Chihuahua apart, right? You don't need a beard, you don't need a truck, you just rip those, maybe that's what it is. But it was very easy for him. But the spirit of heroic strength didn't come on him so he can have traveling mercies. It didn't come on him so that God would help him remember things he didn't study for. It didn't come on him so he could get away with something he shouldn't have. See, Samson had everything he needed because the spirit of heroic strength was inside of him. He just needed to live his life like God was going to come through on his promise. What he was calling him to deliver his people from death. And we can't sometimes control how God's going to come through, but he did come through. And so I'd say, yes, we need to continue to pray for every practical need we have in our life, because even when Jesus teaches about prayer, he teaches us to do that, to bring every need, every practical, real need, because he cares about those things. We do need to pray for everything that's on your mind because he is a peacemaker. He is a deliverer. We do need to pray for his presence to be felt in our life because we're going through difficult things. And he is called Counselor. But imagine if we also begin to pray, or some of us continue to pray, and live in a way where the spirit of heroic strength would have to come through. Like asking God, where are you calling me to stand in the gap? When I think about my workplace, when I think of people I go to school with, when I think about the people I live with, when I think just people I know, God, where are you calling me to step out with courage and faith? That makes me a little uncomfortable because you're going to have to come through. And it's not just desperation, but prayers of faith and expectation. Like, what do you want to see God do in our church? What do you want to see God do in your small group? What do you want to see God do in your workplace? What do you want to see God do in some of the relationships you have? There's this young woman I met a number of years ago when I was pastoring elsewhere. And I remember one evening she asked, hey, can I sit and talk with you? And she had expressed this deep, deep depression she was in. And to a point where she had very little options. She said, I feel like I just can't go on. I remember sitting in that room and going, God, I literally have no idea what to say. I just don't. But you have me in this moment. Would you just give me wisdom? And I just felt like the Lord say, just ask her to commit to coming every week and you'll just pray with her. And so I told her, I'm like, I don't even know what to say. I'm not a professional here, counselor or anything, but I can pray with you. And I just want to make sure you do have help. And so literally for about 8 months, every week she would come after the service, and me and a couple other people, we would just pray for her. And over time, you would see this kind of balancing out in her life. And then I remember I think that was in January, and it was that November where she came to visit me, and countenance was totally changed. And she's like, Thomas, I had an encounter with God that changed my life. And fast forward a few years now, she's a missionary in Korea. and doing wonderful work with God. And God's using her in powerful. And it was nothing about me. It was one of those sense where it's like, God, you have to come through. But I felt like God say, will you just be in the midst of all of that? And I saw God be God. We're called to stand in the way of death for the people we work with, we go to school with, our neighbors and each other. It's uncomfortable. It's scary. And we're not sufficient. But what if we experience the God of heroic strength? What if we experience a God who is our deliverer? What if we experience a God who breaks through and transforms someone's life? What if we put ourselves in an uncomfortable position because it's when we stop, I feel like that's when the Lord can begin. For the last few months, almost daily, I've been reading a passage in Ephesians chapter 6, 10 to 18. And this is what it says. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. And after you've done everything to stand, stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, with your feet fitted with readiness that comes with the gospel of peace. In addition to all of this, take up the shield of faith, which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions, with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. Paul encourages us to stand because our fight is not against flesh and blood. There's something else going on, but we know our God is greater. I think this is the way that we are actually invited to be a little bit more like Samson, because Romans 8 tells us the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you. That's a whole lot of horsepower. So be strong in the Lord. Stand in his mighty power. And so we continue to pray for the things that are going on in our lives. We continue to believe. But what would it be like if we started praying prayers that make us a little uncomfortable because we do need God to come through on someone else's behalf? Can our vision and faith in God be bigger than what we see? So here are your on-ramps this morning. If you're believing for something great right now, keep standing. Keep praying, keep asking God where you need to step out in faith courageously. And can I say it this way? If you're doing it alone, you're doing it the wrong way. Pray with someone else. Gather them to your faith and courageous prayers. Some of you are believing for some really intense things. Make sure you gather people around you who are praying with you, who are lifting you up, who are encouraging you, who stir faith with each other. Maybe you come together in a small group about praying about big things together because that's what you want to do. But don't do it alone. Share it with someone. Allow them inside of that thing that you're really holding on to God for. Secondly, if you feel like your faith is stagnant, I'd encourage you to read Ephesians 6, verses 10 to 18 this week and pray. And ask God to help you see where he's calling you and where you need to stand in his strength and his mighty power. God, help me to see what you see. And then thirdly, for all of us, is to live aware and live present in our everyday life so we can hear and see where God is calling us all the time. Because here's the thing, I felt years ago, I can't remember who said it, but it stuck with me. It's like, our job, and it was meant for pastors, but I think it's actually for all Christians, is to help people recognize where God is already at work. We're never the first movement. God's always working. And I think being aware and present in people's lives is all about being present to go, God, where are you actually already working, and how can I join you in that? But it means being present. It means being aware. What could God be saying or doing in you and through you in this relationship, in this place, in this job site? Where we have to stop, and where can I allow God to be fully God? Maybe even in this community, being present and aware with each other to know what is going on. How do we walk with each other? How do we believe with each other? It's wherever you find yourself, and maybe this does include some of us making things right with God. Because again, Samson's story was a tragedy, but yours doesn't have to be. And maybe this is the Lord telling you to take a step of faith, to walk out of that life of disobedience into a life you were called for, to thrive spiritually. Maybe that's where it starts. If you're believing, keep standing. If your faith is stagnant, ask the Lord, where can I let you be God? And for all of us, let's just continue to live aware and present to God's ongoing work in us and around us. Why don't you stand? I'm going to invite the band to come up. We'll respond in worship, but I'd love to pray over you this morning. Lord, we live, and many of us live lives in situations that feel like we're just like totally out of our depth. And the story of Samson, really the story of the judges and stories of the kings throughout Old Testament history, is a story of the reality that we can never really be the ones who set people ultimately free. It requires you, Jesus. But it's also a story that reminds us that you still partner with us, that we are the vessels that you use to declare your glory, your goodness, your love. And Lord, my prayer is not that we feel like we just need to do more. No, my prayer is, Lord, that we would feel the invitation to allow you to do more. And God, would our hearts and our minds and our lives just be continually open to God, what you want to do. But Lord, would our imagination not be limited? But God, help us to exercise whatever faith we have for someone and something bigger than us, so God, we can see the God of heroic strength come through. God, that we would live lives and pray in a way that we allow you, God, to be God. Jesus, I'm so thankful that really the greatest miracle of salvation you've done in so many of us. But I'm also so thankful that, God, that work is not done yet. And you are still calling people to yourself. So, Jesus, help us to be the kind of people who have a faith that others need. But, Lord, I pray that we would recount stories year after year of how, Lord, you did things so incredibly bigger than us. Mostly because we were just willing to allow you to do it. God, thank you that you're constantly at work. And Lord, may our lives be a response of gratefulness to you, to what you've done, and gratefulness for what you're yet to do. Amen.